Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We have a very interesting show today. Public confidence in the integrity of elections in the United States is at an all-time low. Fear that elections are being stolen erodes the legitimacy of the U.S. government. And the book we will be discussing shortly presents headline-making recommendations to address the serious claims of voter fraud. And that book is Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk by John Fund and Hans von Spakovsky. Our guest author today is Hans von Spakovsky, a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former member of the Federal Election Commission. Welcome to our show, Hans.
Thanks for having me on, Lois.
Do you think Americans frequently demand fair play in other countries' elections, but we are often blind to the need to scrutinize our own? And if so, why?
You know, I think that's very true. There are all kinds of things that we have done in places around the world, such as when Bosnia was setting up their elections the first time, just basic measures to protect the integrity of the election process, and yet when we want to do the same thing here, people get very upset about it.
Right. It's very highly emotional. Well, you know, you wrote in your book that in 2016, the U.S. is on the brink of repeating the 2000 Florida election debacle. But this time it will be in several states with allegations of voter fraud, intimidation, and manipulation of voting machines. Please explain.
Well, look, we have problems in many different areas. One of the most basic ones is that, you know, in half the states of the country, more than half, you don't actually prove that you are who you say you are when you go in to vote. And that opens up our process to all kinds of fraud.
You mean there's no voter ID at all?
That's right.
Okay.
And the same thing is true for absentee ballots.
Okay.
A Florida police department that once looked into massive absentee ballot fraud in Florida said that absentee ballots are the tool of choice of vote thieves. And it's correct. I mean, we detail in the book several cases where vote thieves were prosecuted and convicted in court.
Okay.
These are not imaginary stories.
Okay.
And they used the absentee ballot process to steal elections. Just about a year ago, a county sheriff in West Virginia and a county clerk were in fact convicted, sent to jail for stealing local elections using fraudulent absentee ballots.
And this is in Florida?
No, this was actually in West Virginia. But Florida, remember, 1997, the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation of the mayor's race there, which was overturned because of more than 5,000 fraudulent absentee ballots.
Well, in February of 2012, the Pew Center of the States found that 1.8 million names of deceased persons were still registered to vote on state rolls. I mean, has this been cleaned up?
This has not been cleaned up. Neither has the fact that there are, I think, upwards of 3 million people who are registered in more than one state.
Now, also, I found it interesting to read in your book about the fact that Mexico has a much stricter election system than we have. I mean, how is Mexico's election system different from ours?
Well, Mexico had many problems for a very long time with election fraud.
Okay.
And in the 1990s, they finally decided to do something about it. And they passed laws that provided for a photo ID for every voter in the country, not just a photo ID, but a photo ID actually with a thumbprint on it also. And you cannot cast a ballot when you go into a polling place without bringing that photo ID with you. They've had no problems with turnout going down. In fact, turnout has gone up. And in fact, a lot of people credit that with the fact that, you know, the first time in the 1990s, remember, the opposition party elected a president, I think the first time in 60 years. Okay,
well, that is good. That's good news. And now, what is your response in support of mandatory photo IDs for all voting? I mean, I read an article recently that said that older people had a hard time getting a photo ID. I mean, many were older. They were without transportation. They were short of money. I mean, one woman had lost her birth certificate through her many moves. I mean, should it be that difficult for older Americans to vote if they don't drive and don't have a driver's license? Because then they don't have a photo.
Well,
photo
I
ID.
can tell you many of those claims are untrue. The lady that you're talking about, I believe, who supposedly lost her driver's license, I think was the plaintiff in the Pennsylvania lawsuit against Pennsylvania's new photo ID law. And after telling the judge that there was just no way that she could get an ID, she then took a bus down to the DMV and got her ID within 20 minutes. All of those claims are wildly exaggerated. And how do we know that? We know that because Georgia and Indiana's photo ID laws have been in place now in Georgia for almost 6 years, in Indiana for 8 years.
Okay.
Indiana's law was called the strictest photo ID law in the country by the U.S. Supreme Court. We've had numerous federal elections and state and local elections, and we've got the turnout data from those states. And that data shows that, for example, in Georgia, which is about a third of the population is African American, the turnout of African Americans went up dramatically
with the
in
photo
the
ID,
first presidential election held after the photo ID law went in place. And in fact, their increase in turnout was one of the largest of any state in the U.S. Same thing happened in the next congressional election in 2010. Again, the turnout of not just African Americans but Hispanics went up. Same thing happened in Indiana. So the actual data from evidence on the ground, people turning out to vote, shows it does not keep anyone out of the polls.
But so many people are so critical of photo IDs. I mean, are they not?
Well, frankly, they're just uneducated, and they are not willing to look at the data.
Okay.
Look, in both Indiana and Georgia, the very same claims that are being made right now about North Carolina's new ID, that it'll keep all these people out of the polls, it all turned out not to be true. And in fact, lawsuits were filed in both states.
Sure.
And the lawsuits eventually were dismissed by the federal judges. You know why? Because the plaintiffs in those organizations, including the NAACP, they couldn't come up with a single individual who would be unable to vote because of these voter ID laws. It's important to keep in mind, every state that's passed one of these has also provided that if you don't already have a photo ID, you can get one for free from state officials.
Let's get to the elements of election fraud that you covered in your book. Which is the worst, vote buying or phony voter registration, and why?
It depends on where you are. In some ways, voter fraud is kind of a cultural, regional thing. I mean, for example, Kentucky is infamous for vote buying. Just in the last 5 years, there have been more than a dozen local officials there convicted for vote buying, particularly
local elections then, right?
Yes, local elections, particularly county sheriffs.
Okay.
The money that was being used to buy those votes, frankly, came from drug dealers who wanted county sheriffs who would not give them a hard time. But we know other places where phony registrations allow people to vote. One of the worst cases of this was revealed in the mid-1980s in, of all places, New York City, when the Kings County, which covers Brooklyn, district attorney released a state grand jury report that revealed that for 14 years there had been thousands of fraudulent votes cast in state legislative and congressional primaries in Brooklyn, and a lot of it was by people voting in the names of individuals who were registered to vote but didn't really exist.
Wow. So did anyone go to jail for this? Were there prosecutions?
Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had run.
Okay.
But the grand jury report was in fact made public because the local district attorney, who was a former Democratic congresswoman, wanted people to know what exactly had happened, how bad it had been, and basically wanted to recommend that steps be taken to fix this. One of the recommendations by the local grand jury was the state legislature look at the idea of requiring voter ID.
Yes, again, voter ID. Well, you wrote in your introduction that since Democrats figure prominently in the vast majority of election fraud described in your book, some readers will jump to the conclusion that this is a one-sided attack on a single party. Can you cite some elections when Republicans have been involved in vote fraud?
Sure. You know, it's true that most of the recent cases have been committed by Democrats, but that's because, look, up until the 1930s and 40s, Republicans actually controlled many of the big city machines, places like Kansas City and Philadelphia. And when they did, they also committed vote fraud. In fact, they were infamous for that. One of the reasons so much of it is from Democrats in recent years is because they have taken control of all of these large urban cities. But again, if you want to see some unfortunate examples of Republican voter fraud, again, go back to Kentucky, where we were talking about vote buying. Many of those officials in Kentucky were Republican officials who were convicted
Was
of
this
that.
as early as the 90s or the 80s? Or was
It's been throughout the 80s, 90s, and within the last 5 years.
Okay.
There have been convictions of Republican officials in Kentucky for vote buying.
Interesting. And you also wrote that Democrats are more skilled at encouraging poor people who need money to participate in vote buying schemes. I mean, can you give us some examples of that?
Well, it's unfortunate that there's too many leaders of the Democratic Party who complain about measures to stop vote fraud, but in fact, it is poorer communities who are often the victims of this.
Yes.
One of the cases we talk about is a small rural county in Alabama. It's an entirely Democratic county. It's 80% African American. And the victims there were the poor voters of that community. Many local officials were prosecuted and convicted in the 1990s of committing voter fraud. And
and basically giving cash to people to vote, is that what they were doing?
There was some vote buying in that case too, but the key thing was that this was inter-party voter fraud.
Okay.
These were elected Democratic local officials stealing votes so that they would win elections against African American Democrats who were challenging them and who were reformers.
I see.
They wanted to clean up local government.
So the incumbents were really strong here. They didn't want.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And what people have to understand, particularly in rural counties, is that often, like in this county in Alabama, the local county government is the source of jobs and money in that county.
And influence, that's right.
And that's why those incumbents wanted to hang on to their jobs, and they went to jail for it.
Interesting. Well, I found it very interesting to read in your book that former President Jimmy Carter knows the issue of fraud firsthand, voter fraud. During his first run for office in a Democratic primary in Quitman County, Georgia in 1962, it was stolen by voter fraud. And then Jimmy Carter went to court and got the election overturned and ended up winning the general election for state senator of Georgia. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story to read. It's been written up in more than one biography of him.
Yes.
And that's why people may forget this, but look, in 2005, remember, after the 2000 presidential election, Jimmy Carter formed a vote task force with James Baker, the former Republican Secretary of State, to look at elections in the U.S.
I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah, and they came out with a long report that made many recommendations, one of which was voter ID. And the reason was clearly traced back to his first run for office, because he had real experience with voter fraud, and if he had not gone to court and found a judge willing to look at his case,
he would have been out.
He would have been out. He would not have gotten elected.
That's right. That's right. Well, why hasn't the media covered this more?
Well, I tell you,
intensely.
Unfortunately, there are many in the media who have bought into this idea that, well, there's no voter fraud, and we don't want to publish stories about it. One of the most amusing, of course, of that is the New York Times,
right,
which is constantly saying there's no voter fraud, and yet they will ignore cases like the one I told you about
in New York.
In New York.
That's interesting. I also found it interesting to read that many illegal immigrants in our country register to vote so they can obtain documents and identifying them as U.S. citizens. I mean, how can they register to vote if they are illegal immigrants?
Well, because we unfortunately have an honor system. When you fill out a voter registration form, you are asked whether or not you are a U.S. citizen.
Yes.
And you're supposed to put down a yes or a no. And that's all there is to check on that.
Oh, that's it?
That's it. There's no verification done. And one of the things we talk about in the book is specific cases from all over the country of people who are not U.S. citizens who have voted. In the 2012 election, a local TV station down in Florida went to the county clerk. This is the clerk for the courts.
Right.
where jury summonses are sent. Now, anybody who's been called for a jury knows that one of the questions you're asked is, are you a United States citizen?
Exactly.
Well, they got the names of everybody who'd been called for jury duty who was excused because they were not a U.S. citizen. Well, where had the clerk gotten the jury list? From the voter registration list. They went and tried to interview a number of the people who had said they were not U.S. citizen when they discovered that many of them had voted in multiple elections.
That's right.
A number of them admitted they weren't U.S. citizens, but they voted anyway.
That's right. They certainly are going to, and they'll probably keep on doing it, right? Well, besides Jimmy Carter's tough election, has voter fraud affected an election's outcome in many instances?
Yeah, there are a number of cases of it. I'll tell you one that just happened just a few weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, a man pleaded guilty to voter fraud in Kansas City, Missouri. It turned out he was the uncle of the winning Democratic candidate who won his election by one vote.
One vote?
One
Whoa.
vote. And so the uncle's vote was clearly the vote that got him over. I'll give you another example most people have not heard about, which I actually find very amazing, is just a couple of weeks ago, 4 individuals were sentenced after being convicted in Indiana. What were they sentenced for? In 2008, they forged many of the signatures on the ballot petitions that got Barack Obama qualified to be on the May 2008 Democratic primary ballot.
So they had to have so many ballots to
like in many states, Virginia is one, you've got to get the signatures of a certain number of registered voters to be on the ballot.
Okay.
These 4 individuals forged so many signatures that if it had been discovered at the time, Barack Obama would have been under the minimum needed to be on the ballot.
In Indiana.
In Indiana.
Wow,
so
that's
he would not have been on the ballot for a major state's
That's
primary.
amazing. That is amazing. Phew. Well, what are the statistics regarding the issue that voter ID laws reduce the turnout in states that have them?
Well, as I said, we know that's not true. Because
Okay.
we've got the turnout data from states that have had voter ID in place, and in fact, the turnout of black voters and
actually increases.
It has actually increased. It has not. I'm not going to tell you that photo ID is the reason it increased, but we do know that it did not suppress that vote, and that's because look, the claims that large numbers of Americans don't have photo ID. I mean, they're just silly. You cannot function in society without an ID. And quite frankly, often poor people have a greater need for it. You cannot apply for food stamps, all kinds of welfare.
Without a photo ID.
Without photo IDs. And that's just one of the many places where you've got to have
that's
it.
a very good point. That's a very good point. Now, let's look at your career at the Justice Department. I mean, didn't you join the voting section as a career trial lawyer in 2001? What was your experience like?
It was a very unpleasant experience.
Why is that?
Well, because most people believe that the career civil service ranks of the federal government are filled with nonpartisan, objective individuals, and I found that not to be true.
Oh, really?
I found the career ranks filled with very partisan individuals. I found that often biased them in their analysis, and that they wanted to push positions that were not justified by the law.
Well, then you basically only served a brief time then, what 3 or 4 years?
I was there for 4 years.
4 years, okay. And tell us about Brian Sells, one of the new deputy chiefs who was hired in the voting section of the Justice Department. I think I read that didn't Sells once say that state laws that don't allow felons to vote is a slap in the face to democracy. I mean, is that true?
Yeah, one of the problems in this administration, and really it's something that should not happen at all, is that the Obama administration, unfortunately, has been taking people who would be well qualified as political appointees, but has been hiring them into career civil service positions. This gentleman is one of them. You can disagree on whether or not felons should vote or not, But the point is that under our Constitution,
they can't.
The 14th Amendment specifically says that states have the ability to take away your right to vote if you're convicted of a felony.
Right.
Now, the big argument is at what point, once someone has served their sentence, should they get it back?
Right.
But here they hired someone into a career position who has this view that is completely against the Constitution. And he's the one that's pushing through and making recommendations on the enforcement of voting cases.
Yes, but then I think a lot of people can say, well, many Americans were convicted as felons because of drug use or drug problems, and so therefore there's a huge group that want to vote. I mean, they've served their time, and so it's up to the states, I guess, to amend those laws or to make it easier for them maybe to be forgiven. Or
look, it's up to the states to make that decision. There's even 2 states in the country, Vermont and Maine, where you can still vote when you're actually in prison.
Okay.
They don't take the vote that right away at all.
Okay.
But I'll tell you something that I found quite ironic about this issue is many of the groups that say that we should immediately give felons the right to vote back as soon as they're out of prison. Well, the right to vote is not the only thing you lose when you get convicted of a felony.
Right.
You lose many other things. You can't be a notary public. You can't serve on a jury. You can't own a gun, which is, of course, a Second Amendment right.
Right, right.
And you don't usually find the same people pushing to give the right to vote back to felons also saying, well, we should give all these other rights back, including their right to own a gun.
Very good point. Now, since the 2000 presidential elections, there have been many calls to abolish the Electoral College. And even before 2000, there were more than 700 proposals introduced in Congress to amend the Constitution to change the Electoral College. Right. Why is it important, in your view, to not change the language in the Constitution regarding the Electoral College?
Well, it's really interesting. If you go back and you look at James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, the reasons they put in an Electoral College still apply today. The main reason for that was that the framers were afraid that if you only had a popular vote, then anyone running for president would simply go to the largest urban centers, and they would ignore the more rural areas of the country.
Yes.
That is as true today as it was back then.
Okay.
It's a way of making sure that areas of the country that are not as densely populated as places like New York or Los Angeles do get attention from people running for president. And that way, candidates have to win regional elections all over the country. And it gets us, I think, people who are more appealable to a broader scope of the American people. Okay.
Many of our military service members are not voting. I mean, in the 2008 election, only approximately 30% voted compared to 62% of the voting eligible population. Why are the military not voting?
Well, a lot of that, unfortunately, is the blame of the Pentagon. There was an Inspector General report that was released shortly before the 2012 election that pointed out that the Pentagon had not taken a number of steps that they were supposed to take that had not just been recommended but were part of federal law to improve the ability of military people to vote. Look, when you're in the military, you move a lot.
You do.
You move often, and unfortunately, mail doesn't always catch up with you, including absentee ballots.
I see.
And many places we're not mailing out, that is election officials, we're not mailing out ballots to overseas voters.
In a timely manner, right?
In a timely manner, because it takes so long for the ballot to get overseas. The soldier then has to vote it and then has to mail it back.
Wow, wow. And what do you think about same-day registration?
I think it's a very bad idea. It's an invitation to fraud because there's no way when you register and then immediately vote for local election officials to do any kind of verification of you. I mean, just something as basic as checking state correction records to see if in fact you're a felon and therefore not entitled to vote. They can't do that.
I see. And what about provisional ballots? Do you think, how do you clarify them, provisional ballots?
Well, people should understand that a federal law passed in 2002 required every state to provide provisional ballots.
Okay.
What those are is if you show up at a polling place, and for some reason election officials believe you're not entitled to vote. Let's say your name, for example, is not on the voter registration list. You do still get to vote, but they hand you a provisional ballot. This is kept separate from all the other ballots, and election officials will look at that after Election Day and try to determine whether or not you should have been allowed to vote and whether your vote counts.
I see, I see. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the fact that Colin Powell, who served as Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, slammed North Carolina's new voting law in a speech. He said the law hurts the Republican Party, punishes minority voters, and makes it more difficult to vote. Now, as a fellow Republican, what is your reaction to Mr. Powell's views?
Well, I'm a believer in secure and fair elections first before I think about party. And with all due respect to Colin Powell, he's never spent a single day working in a polling place. Okay, I was a local county election official for 8 years. I spent 4 years at the Justice Department enforcing federal voting rights laws, and he really doesn't know what he's talking about.
Okay, well, Hans, now where can our viewers find your book?
They can find it easily at Amazon.com. It's called, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us today. Hoping that more people will read this book and take action against voter fraud.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching The Bookman's Corner. Please join us again next month for a new edition. Thank you. I'm Lois Lindstrom.